So hopefully everyone can now hear me. I'm Sharon Roberts, and welcome again to our June Lane County Master Gardeners Association seminar, online seminar at 2 p.m. in the afternoon. I have just a quick note to let people know that we will have a change for July. We're going to have a different speaker, and hopefully all that information is going to come out in the Garden Gate. And of course, Jet's always helpful with lots of email reminders, but look for a change for July, but count on the fact that we will have a seminar. So today it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Eliza Mason, who's going to talk about dry farming in Lilliputopia. Dr. Mason was just telling us, and probably many of you overheard that, did a lot of woofing around throughout the country, but her degrees initially, she has a background in molecular biology and a PhD in microbiology, and now serves as the director on the board of the Dry Farming Institute and the Benton County Soil and Water Conservation District. When everything is under control at Lilliputopia, she spends her free time hunting for wild mushrooms. So it's a real pleasure today to have Eliza with us. And she has a point in which she has a question, a slide indicating time for questions. So as the seminar goes along, if you type your questions into the chat or the Q&A, we will help facilitate asking questions when we get to that point. So thank you, Eliza, and it's all yours.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. This is a fun talk, and I've given it a couple times, but here we go. So I'm Eliza. My farm is called Lilliputopia. We have a Facebook and Instagram if you want to follow us, and a website. But we're going to talk about dry farming today. You already heard my bio, but I just like to have this little slide here. I was a microbiologist, and sort of this is the theme of my farm, is that small things matter. I really think that the microbes and our little creatures are what are foundations for our soil and our food. So I founded Lilliputopia in 2017 in Monroe, Oregon. So if you're close by, you can always contact me and we give tours. I also am a contract editor, and I'm a director on the Soil and Water Conservation District in Benton County, and a new nonprofit called the Dry Farming Institute, which was just formed but will provide resources for growers who are interested in dry farming. If you were wondering where the name comes from, Lilliputopia, it comes from a book called Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift, and it's a really old book, but it's a great book, and it's about this guy Gulliver. It's a satire, and he travels to different places, and one of the places that he travels to is called Lilliput, and it has a bunch of teeny tiny little people. And so that again goes along with our theme that we are interested in tiny things and small things matter. So a little bit about my farm. I founded it in 2017. It's located in the city of Monroe, and I actually have a pretty big parcel here. It's 3.5 acres. It wasn't a farm before, so I'm turning it into a farm. So there wasn't any irrigation or infrastructure. My goals are to identify and disseminate the best practices for sustainably growing organic fruits and vegetables at tiny scales. And this turned out to be through dry farming because we don't have irrigation, and then to provide that food to the local community. And to do that, we started a small farmers market in Monroe, which may or may not be canceled this year, but we are also opening a small farm store. And right now it's open by appointment, so if you want to come check it out, just contact me. But this is where we sell our produce and other local handmade items. But let's get into the dry farming. To grow the plants, you need water, right? All plants need water, and all farms use water. And usually they use water through irrigation systems, and that can be through lots of different ways: sprinklers, drip irrigation, flood irrigation. But at our site, we didn't have any infrastructure, and there are some challenges to irrigation that we had to overcome. So we didn't have any infrastructure. We're located in the city, which means we could use city water, but it's really expensive to use that. We also were lucky enough to have a low GPM well, but that wasn't really sufficient to irrigate either. I looked into drilling a new well, which seemed really costly and also risky, because who knows how much water you could get. We also have a sloped hillside, which means that could be a challenge to pumping water up there or storing it, etc. I also noticed when I was working at different farms how there would be lots of problems with irrigation and leaking, and that always drove me nuts with seeing the leaks, the waste, and then the weeds growing like crazy around them. So I was lucky enough to find this group called the Dry Farming Collaborative, which is led by Amy Garrett at OSU. And this is a group of growers, educators, plant breeders, and professionals that partner to increase their knowledge and awareness of dry farming management practices with a hands-on participatory approach. So they're really inclusive, and growers of any size are welcome to join, and super friendly and informative. And so I joined their group. You can join their group on Facebook. And they have annual meetings and field days in August. So I pretty much joined this immediately and made friends with a lot of people. So at OSU, they have several different studies and projects which you're sort of automatically privy to, and you can choose to join those studies if they need trial farms. So we joined and we did variety trials. You could volunteer to be to be one of the farms that they show on the field days. They did a site suitability study, a fungal inoculant study, some interviews, and these things I'll mention a bit later. But I just wanted to say that this group was really, really valuable to me, and super helpful. And if you want to dry farm, you should join. So what is dry farming? Their definition at OSU of dry farming is crop production without irrigation during a dry season, usually in a region that receives at least 20 inches of annual rainfall and utilizes the moisture stored in the soil from the rainy season. And this way, we do not use any irrigation after planting. Some people will use a little irrigation, and that's during planting or just to get the plants established, but usually after that, they cut irrigation. Or if there's no irrigation available, then you just don't ever irrigate. And it is regional, so it depends on where you live. But for example, here, this is in Independence, Oregon, is a graph showing the temperature and rainfall. And as you probably know, in the summer when it's hot, we don't get any rain. But in the winter, we get a lot of rain. And in that way, our soil is basically charged with the water that the plants can use in the summer to grow. So dry farming doesn't mean no water, right? Because all plants need water. They just don't receive irrigation. And the plants then will tap into the water of the soil. And as the water table retreats, the plant roots follow the water down. You can see on the right that illustration. The history of dry farming is old. So prior to irrigation systems or no other way to farm. And the Native Americans used dry farming a lot. And one example is the Three Sisters. Maybe you've heard of that, the corn, beans, and squash, where the corn acts like as a trellis for the beans and the squash shades the roots. And this can be done and has been done with dry farming. And that's this picture here. We did this last year and it was very successful, I'd say. But because this is a traditional, more primitive way of farming, a lot of this knowledge has been lost, unfortunately. As our technology has increased, we have just used irrigation and haven't looked back. But I think it's important that we try to regain that knowledge and understand these primitive technologies because they'll be important in our future with climate change. However, there are some places in the Pacific Northwest and in California that do have dry farming, and that is used, for example, in hazelnuts, grapes, and cereal grains. However, with the perennials or trees, they usually irrigate it the first couple of years. So why should we use dry farming? There's lots of reasons. First, like I said, climate change, it's becoming hotter and drier, less water. We use reduced inputs and therefore there's less cost involved. Especially here in Oregon, there's water rights, which you may or may not have. The cost of the infrastructure and the labor of maintaining that infrastructure and also of weeding. I'll talk a little bit about that later, but there's a lot less weeding. The produce that you do have has increased flavor, nutrition, and storage ability. So for example, winter squash will store much longer in a dry condition than in an irrigating condition. We also have less susceptibility to mold and fungus and less tomato cracking, of course, if you're not irrigating. You also don't have as much pollution or runoff because you're not really saturating the soil again with water. This is just a slide showing climate change and how it is affecting our region. So the 30-year average from 1980 to 2010, you can see the heat map on the left, and on the right you see it from a couple years ago, 2018, and we're really heating up. And with the temperature rise, there's also drought and decreased availability of water. But are there any reasons why we shouldn't dry farm, or are there drawbacks? And of course there are. This is not a yield maximization strategy at all. So you can see from the picture, this is from last year's. It's not lush, it's completely different than an irrigated garden. There are reduced yields per plant. The fruits are also smaller. And you basically have one shot in the summer of getting your crops in. There's no succession planting. And so once something dies or something's done harvesting, then you can't really plant unless you haul out water. Therefore, dry farming is most useful in the context where irrigation is not available or is prohibitively expensive. However, these conditions are becoming more and more common now, right? And so it's good to invest in the strategy where we can have reduced inputs. So how does dry farming work? This is sort of what we do. We amend our soil before planting, so sort of in the winter, spring time. We add a bunch of compost. And then we plant in May and June. And that's really important because, especially in May, we try to get everything in May. The soil is very wet still. And that means it's charged. It's hopefully drying out a little bit so you can work the soil, but it's still saturated enough for the plants to become established. So we do both seeding, direct seeding and transplanting. And we seed them or transplant a little bit deeper than you would normally. We use wider spacing so that each plant can have more resources around it. And conventional dry farmers use this light cultivation, they call it dust mulch, which is basically no mulch, but it keeps the surrounding dirt very fine, which they think helps a lot. We weed it initially, and especially since basically at the beginning, the weeds can germinate when it's wet. However, as it dries out, the weeds don't germinate, and so you have way less weeding. But you do want to kill any weeds that could be competing for water with your plants. And then you harvest, and that's pretty much it. You don't have to worry about watering. You don't have to worry about fertilizing. And there's way less weeds, so that's awesome. So I'll just show you some pictures of our vegetable plots from our place, and then there's some of OSU too. So I started with 36 plots that were 100 square feet. So they were 5 feet by 20 feet. And this year I expanded to 54 plots. So I basically increased it by a third. This is what it looks like when I'm planning out what to plant. So the 3 rows of my plots and lots of different varieties here. What I do is just a big mix of everything. I like to try and experiment with whole new things. So you can see I have some perennials. I have a lot of tomatoes. I tried some flowers this year. But we'll talk more about those varieties. This is a view from this year, and it's looking northeast. This was the first photo in May, right after we pretty much finished with planting, I think. And you can see a whole lot of bare ground because plants haven't germinated yet. And at the far end over here is garlic and artichokes, which are already growing out there. And so we have June 1st. I put the row cover on. These were squash. And you can see now the tomatoes are coming up. Here are all the tomatoes, and we've been mulching them as we go on. And then this was yesterday, and you can see everything's growing pretty good down here. These guys kind of got hit by slugs, which was too bad. And then we have a lot more squash, zucchini, and then peppers and stuff are way back there. Here's some pictures from last year. And they'll be from all different perspectives, so it might be a little confusing. But last year I tried some greens, kale. These are the artichokes when I first planted them that year. Here are the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash. Some more corn behind it. In July, it's you can tell that the grass is drying out, but everything is loving the heat at that point and growing really fast. Here's mid-July, and have my squash here, and corn, three sisters, tomatoes. I think these are eggplants or peppers, and then ground cherries and tomatoes. But you can tell now, yeah, the ground is quite dry and the grass is dry. And by August, it's sort of withering. All out of my greens are totally done, all bolted. And some of the things will slow down too, like the zucchini. They actually got attacked by deer too, so that was unfortunate. Here's some pictures from OSU trial site, the Lewis Brown farm from a couple years ago. Again, showing the progression of what it looks like in May after they till the field and plant, and in June stuff is coming up, the beans, the tomatoes are all transplanted, the corn are coming up. And in July, again, when the heat comes on, they really love it. They grow pretty well. Oh, okay. So now is our break for questions. Does that work?
That works.
Yeah. So we've got a couple of questions that have come in. One question, what are the criteria, or how do you go about choosing or selecting a property or a site for a dryland farm? Are there special considerations?
Yeah, we're going to talk about that soon, but there are a lot of things to think about. Mostly, I would say the soil, and if you can get the soil tested, that's great. Other than that, it's water availability and variety. I mean, you get to choose your varieties. So I tell people to experiment and try everything themselves. So you never know until you try. And last year I was able to grow kale until the beginning of July. So yeah, I hope I answered your question.
Okay, well, you mentioned getting a soil test, and maybe you're going to answer this in a minute, but what are you looking for? Is there anything you're looking for in particular in the soil for a dryland farm?
Mm-hmm. Organic matter for sure.
Okay.
And I will mention that.
Okay.
That is the water holding capacity of your soil.
Mm-hmm. And along those lines, then there was a question about things that you might do for soil water retention. So do you use things like biochar?
This year we are experimenting with biochar. I haven't heard of any other experiments of other people doing it, but we try a whole bunch of things. We're doing heavy mulching this year too, and I would imagine that would be really helpful in this context, as it's sort of insulating the ground and keeping it cooler and wetter. But then again, the conventional dry farmers don't use any mulch at all. So
Yeah, that seems kind of odd. We always hear about mulching so that things don't dry out.
well, I think it is a scale thing too. So, bigger
Oh,
farms
okay.
can't really get their mulch in there very easily.
Okay. We have a question too about whether or not something like dry farming, does it work in raised beds?
Great question. And no, we don't recommend it in raised beds at all, because Raised beds are good because you can use your own good soil, but it also drains much faster than planting in the ground. And the reason that dry farming works is because the ground is basically a big sponge for the water, and that will allow your plants to have access to the water the whole season. And so if you're in a raised bed, you'll lose that water much more quickly.
Okay. I think this is a question that maybe you're going to get to, but because you've said that you're doing tests of different plant varieties, do you find then that different varieties do better or worse with dry farming?
Absolutely, absolutely. And it was really good to hook up with the Dry Farming Collaborative because there's, the network of people who have tried different things. So there's certainly varieties, which I will name soon, which are very easy to grow in the dry farm context. And then as I found out just experimenting, a lot of things don't do well. um, so it's fun to try new things, but there's definitely varieties that either have drought tolerance or earlier varieties which can fruit earlier, which will sort of guarantee you your harvest do
Ah,
better.
okay. I think actually getting back to thinking about water retention, a question just came in about sheet mulching or using cover crops in the winter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have had challenges using cover crops. The reason being is because to establish the cover crop in the fall requires some water. So I'm not sure. I've tried to ask people about this, but um, getting your cover crop big enough by the time it gets cold and wet has been a challenge for us at least. And but after broadcasting, for example, fava beans or whatever your cover crop is in the fall and not having the rain to germinate it is a problem. And then, birds and stuff come eat it. But I do think cover crops are really great. And if you can get the timing right, are a really good thing to do. Sheet mulching too, that's what we did actually. Yeah, we had a lot of cardboard and we were sheet mulching. We aimed to be no-till, so we tried to get all the weeds covered up. So yeah, good question.
I would suppose with something like sheet mulching, you're wanting to make certain that you're doing things where the water will go through into the ground as opposed to like plastic sheets where it would just run off, right?
That's a good question. And because we are more of a small scale, maybe, I wasn't really concerned with that. I have experimented with tarping before with plastic tarps, or we use the lumber tarps that they're, they don't let the water through. However, just because it rains so much here in the winter, I found that when I lifted the tarps, it was totally saturated under them. And because it's not just one huge tarp, the water finds a way to get under there. So that was actually a good way to suppress weeds in the winter, is using those tarps
Oh, okay.
for sure.
And actually, we've got one other question that's come in at this point. With the tomatoes, whether you stake them or just let them sprawl, is there kind of anything you do
Mm-hmm.
differently in terms of husbandry of your plants?
Yeah, it's basically total neglect. The tomatoes, we don't touch them. They sort of just make a bush and sprawl on the ground. Um, this year I did hear that someone might be trying a trellised system and pruning to one liter, but for the most part, people don't prune them, and the reason is because in the dry context, they don't really get any slugs or fungal diseases from touching the ground if they do. So the plants are a little more compact and manageable, and they aren't really harmed if they touch the ground. So we just leave them.
All right. Those are the questions that have come in thus far. So I'll keep an eye on it as we go on.
Okay, great. Let's move on.
All righty.
Okay, so this half, I'll just talk about some of our different experiments and the varieties. So this year, our collaboration with OSU was a little bit scaled back, and we're only doing variety trials. Last year, we did several different projects, and those included inoculation with fungi, again, the variety trials, which is every year. We did some different spacings, and we also had this wider project on site suitability. So that's how different sites are suitable or not for dry farming. So that I've wanted to touch on this because the fungi are also one of my hobbies. So this was exciting for me. So we were using a proprietary mycorrhizal fungi, which you've probably seen these different products available. And these fungi form symbiosis with plants. If you've ever seen these products before, there's two kinds of the mycorrhizal fungi, endomycorrhizae, which are far more common, and I think almost 90% of all plants have these interactions in which the fungi actually penetrate the plant cells, and in doing so they exchange their nutrients in water. And the ectomycorrhizae, which form a shield around the plant root, and they do not penetrate cells. And that is much more common in forests, trees, and perennials. So our experiment was to compare an inoculated field corn with an untreated or a control corn, which was, normal corn. And Lucas, who was managing the study, he found that there was a 21% increase in corn yield and 23% in beans. And I found that my corn, I was part of the study, my corn did grow significantly better when it was inoculated, and that was really exciting. But he also found that there was no difference in squash, or maybe even a slight negative effect. And so that was really interesting too, because you never know what happens in your experiments, but that's the point, right, is to find out. So a little bit more about these symbioses. It's really interesting. The plant gets many benefits. They have increased nutrient acquisition, increased water uptake. They can have disease and pest resistance, and also stress tolerance, including heat, drought, or cold. And so that's sort of why this was really intriguing to us as dry farmers, is that maybe inoculation with these fungi would confer a real advantage to our plants. If you are wondering, the plants provide food to the fungi and a good home. So I like to think of them as the Oompa Loompas in the factory, sort of doing everything in the background and keeping things running. So we'll move on to talk about varieties. This year, in collaboration with OSU, we're looking at different tepary beans. Those are different kinds of beans that are grown in more arid regions. We have 3 different varieties of those, and we're also testing delicata squash for the first time, I think. And so those 2 are with OSU, and then for my own experiments, I'm doing a lot of different things, but I'm trying a bunch of flowers this year. including some perennials, yarrow, what else? Status, some other things. They don't seem to be doing too well. I'm also doing tomatillos, which are doing better, and cucumbers, and then more perennials, sunchokes. I have sunchokes, artichokes, and yarrow as my perennials this year. Last year, we tried ground cherries, which are similar to tomatillos, another solanaceous plant, if you're not familiar, but they're really delicious little fruits that come off, and they were wildly successful with total neglect. We also planted our artichokes for the first time, which did fruit the first year, and I've been harvesting them this year too, so they've all survived and done well. Our corn from the Three Sisters was very good, and then, like I said, we tried kale. It was a red Russian kale, which did pretty good until July, and some other things didn't do well. Broccoli, I tried mustard, and those all bolted almost immediately in May when it got hot, so wouldn't recommend those. And then, of course, tomatoes are superb. We had some eggplants and again the ground cherries. We were doing a field corn called Open Oak Party Mix. We had dry beans called Whipple, this banana squash called North Georgia Candy Roaster, which is really excellent. Early Girl Slicer tomatoes. We had several different watermelons, including Desert King, and a couple different zucchini as well. And one of the other projects that I didn't participate in, but was very successful, was dry farm potatoes. And they tried a bunch of different kinds, all different colors. It was very interesting. And they had a dry farm potato taste testing last year too. It was really good. This year I planted a couple of them. This one in particular, the purple Peruvian, did really, really well. And it's supposed to, well, the yields were outstanding, and the shape of them is sort of oblong, is supposed to really help in our clay, our heavy clay soil. So a lot of you probably have clay, and maybe you could try that one. And then, like I said, I'd go over the best varieties if you want to try dry farming, and you're sort of afraid of choosing varieties that, you know, are questionable. These are the ones that you should try first, because you will be successful. Dark star zucchini. So this is just a typical dark green zucchini, but the vines are super vigorous, and we already have some on our plants outside. And compared to other zucchini that I've also tried dry farming so far, it's always the best. And it's almost twice as large comparatively. We always grow the Early Girl tomato. It's a hybrid, but in our climate, it's the earliest tomato I've seen, and I do like the flavor. So we always grow Early Girl, and OSU trials always grow Early Girl. And also the banana squash called North Georgia Candy Roaster. It's a very sweet winter squash. It's yummy, it's easy to peel. The only thing is that they can get really big, so, but that's not a bad thing, right? And then in general, like every tomato that I've grown has done well and has produced, especially if you want to try cherry tomatoes. They are very prolific, and they're totally fine without water. Like I mentioned previously, the ground cherries did really well. I tried eggplant for the first time and a variety called Diamond, which did really well. And then, like I said, the artichokes are more of a spring crop, so they don't really need I guess they produce while there's still water in the soil, so it's a freebie. You don't need to water them. And garlic is sort of the same way, where they put on a lot of their growth in the winter and spring months. So those are easy to do if you don't have access to water. I wanted to mention quickly blossom end rot disease, because that's really common here in the Northwest. And it's caused by a variety of different things: calcium, water frequency. Unfortunately, it seems like not a lot is known about it, but because there's so many reasons why you could have it. But it's also higher in the paste varieties of tomatoes. And we notice that we get more of it as the season progresses, especially even in varieties that are supposed to be resistant, like Early Girl. One of the projects they did at OSU was looking at the grafted tomatoes, and as well as looking at the incidence of this blossom end rot over time in our dry farm tomatoes. But they found that using the grafted tomatoes, which means they're using a different root stock that perhaps is more drought tolerant, using those graft tomatoes, they had a 33% reduction in blossom end rot, which is interesting, but those grafted ones are much more expensive. And again, this is another reason why to grow cherry tomatoes, because they never get this. And you get a lot of tomatoes. So let's talk about the site suitability study and what makes a good dry farming site. This was one of the questions. So every site is different, and there's a different microclimate, there's different terrain, there's different slopes. The surrounding land is different, or the history of the land is different. And then the soil is different too. So these are all different things which will affect how your plants are growing, but the main thing that we focus on is the soil properties. So how do we look at the soil, and why do we care about the soil? I'm sure you all know that the soil is really, really important. Here's a little picture of some grass that I pulled up. It has tons of this fungi mycelium network in there with mulch, just showing how much biology there is, under each little plant. And I found this cool little poster on the internet. Just a bunch of facts about the soil that I thought was really interesting, and wanted to point out this one here was that a 1% increase in organic matter can result in 25,000 gallons of available water per acre to your plants. So the soil is really important, and getting your organic matter up so that you can retain your water and hold it throughout the season for your plants. I mentioned soil testing before, so part of our suitability study is testing our soil in the plots. And so OSU helped with all of that. We compared all of our soils, but just to see what a sample might look like, I think this is from ours. Basically, you look at the soil chemistry, the pH, and then all these different things. And I think the most important thing is the organic matter percentage. So if you get your soil tested, I think that's one really valuable thing to look at, Some of the other things like nitrogen might not be a reliable information because it can change really fast. But looking at the organic matter will tell you how much water your soil can hold. So here mine says 5.2%. That's relatively high. If you have, you know, 1 or 2%, that might be a bit lower, and your goal would be to increase it as much as you can by adding any organic matter, compost, mulch, etc., to increase your water holding capacity. So in addition to the soil tests, we invited the soil scientist, Andy, to each farm, and he took a soil profile by taking a 5-foot soil core and compared it from each farm and compared that to the listed NRCS soil. I don't know how they got it, you know, a century ago or something. And we found that most of them were wrong just because of the scale of each place, and everywhere is different. So they have all these different categories, and Andy looked at the cores and either recategorized them and wrote a description of each one and possibly anything that might affect your growing ability, and wrote that up into our report. We also put these water sensors into the field, and these these were installed at different depths so that we could measure the amount of water in the field over time. And that was really interesting because we could see how the fields were drying out over the season. So, for example, this is from my farm, and you can see on the graph the time along this axis, and then the y-axis is showing the water availability. So at the 0 is actually fully saturated with water, and then 200 would be no water left, dry, right? So in this case, we could see at the 12-inch depth, my water was completely dry, like in August. But it seemed like even at 2 feet and 3 feet and 4 feet, I still had a lot of water left, which you might think sounds really good. But in reality, when I compared my yields to other farms who had really good yields or high yields, their excuse me, their plots looked more like this, where their soils were drying out a lot more evenly at each depth, which was interpreted to say that the plants were able to access all of that water, whereas perhaps in my context, it was more clay and they had barriers to accessing the water, and the water just sat there unavailable to them. So these are all hypotheses. We don't really know what's true or not, but it's really interesting, and we clearly have so much more to learn. I'll talk a little bit about having a dry orchard. So at Lilliputopia, we have a mixed fruit orchard, and I interplanted them with different nitrogen fixing shrubs. And I did have to hand water the first and second year. This was the first year, so you can see they're really pretty puny. And it was scary not having water to them. And I probably lost now about 15% of my original plantings, but this year they're looking really, really good. There's some things you can do for your dry orchard, which I didn't know about when I planted mine. So if you want to try it, here's some tips. Start with the young trees. So the smaller you can get, the better, because you want to have the most time for your plants to adapt to your conditions. Use the biggest rootstock, which is standard size. And that's because the roots are the ones that are seeking the water, and you want them to explore as much soil as you can because they're not going to be pampered. Even if you don't want giant trees, the thing is, in a dry farm scenario, they're not going to get that big because they're not going to get extra water. So you should use standard size only. You also want to prune them hard, and that's because the pruning the first couple years will help them shuttle most of their energy back into their roots and make sure that they don't have any flowers or fruit those first couple years. And then again, you might need to water them. We had to hand water them just so that they didn't die. It might be a drought year or whatever, and you should protect your investments if you can. So how can we improve dry farming performance? OSU came up with most of these, and then I added some at the bottom of my own sort of recommendations. And the first three are kind of the most important in the context of dry farming, is to map your soils, get them tested, and only farm the soils that have the highest available water holding capacity. Makes sense? Choose the crops and varieties that are appropriate for dry farming. So I would not recommend dry farming lettuce or mustard like I tried. Plant early as you can, but you got to be really careful about the frosts too, because you really want to make sure that it's warm enough so that your plants don't die and that you can get it into the field without compacting your soil. But we've shown that planting earlier rather than later has been better because the plants can establish and can get their roots in, and then when it does heat up, grow much more quickly. These ones are just kind of obvious. Correct any pH or nutrient deficiencies that you might have. Don't compact your soil. If you can ameliorate your compacted layers. Kill your cover crops early so that you can amend and plant early. Control your weeds, which isn't that hard because you shouldn't have any later on. And then either mulch your soil or prevent the cracking. You've probably seen here, since the soil has a lot of clay often, that the soil will form these really big cracks, and that's where a lot of the moisture can escape. So you'll want to be either mulching that or going over it with a hoe so that it breaks up the cracks and seals them up so that the water doesn't escape. And then one more thing that I added was use a row cover on the cucurbits till June. And that helps not only warm them up at night, but prevents the cucumber beetles from attacking them. I've had a lot of challenges, lots of pests. That's really typical for anyone trying to grow any plants here. Like I said, the soil cracking, you have to learn to go observe that and make sure you ameliorate it. The weather can be tough, and the cover crop thing, like I sort of mentioned that earlier with our questions, I've had challenges getting the cover crop to germinate and grow enough by the time it gets cooler. So that's things that we're always working on, trying to figure out. That's kind of the end. And I have a resource slide for you, how to contact me at my email. please join the Facebook group if you want to be part of the Dry Farming Collaborative. We have our Dry Farming Institute website up. We will also have the OSU field days. This year, I think they're going to be virtual field days. And the Oregon Extension, obviously, Small Farms Program are helpful resources. And there's also some books that are available as well. So thanks, and hopefully I can answer some more questions now.
That was great. Thank you. So I'm not sure where Sharon is, so I'm going to jump in with some of the questions.
Yeah, thanks. I forgot to unmute. Go ahead.
Well, we'll just start with the first one. Kyle asked, is this related to depth of organic matter? I'm not sure what that's in relation to.
That question came up at the time that you were talking about how at the different depths of soil you were losing water at different rates, and she wondered if that correlates with the depth of organic matter.
I'm sure it does. I'm not 100% sure, but we found in our soil core that we had a couple different clay layers. So we hypothesized that the clay layers were kind of blocking the water from, or the plant roots from going down, or the water from coming up. So typically the organic matter is going to be only, in the top soil in the very top. But it is an interesting question of how the whole soil core that far down, how that the soil organic matter and the soil chemistry really matters that far, because the plant roots do go that down if they do go that far down if they can, but no one really tests that far down, so it's hard to know.
And somebody, I think, kind of following up on this is asking about whether all of sort of your ideas are all still relevant if you're thinking about just simply trying to use less water, maybe not going completely dry farming.
Yep, absolutely. If you have access to water, that's great. It will increase your yield, but you can also use less water, because we've shown even if you cut half, irrigate every other row, that row in between, you can grow those tomatoes totally fine. And you'll be surprised at how little water some plants will need. So it's definitely good to see how much you can cut your water, because most of the time people overwater. And that's another reason why you can use those water sensors too, to see how much water your plants really need.
Okay, and a couple of questions just kind of about your practices. Did you say you plant seeds as well as starts?
Yes, we do direct seed corn and beans and some squash.
Would that basically be the things that people typically start from seed versus starting from transplants?
Yes, but you can also transplant those as well, and I'm considering doing more transplants just because the birds kind of peck the seeds and eat the seedlings, and I've had problems with slugs this year. So the transplants do well because they're sort of in a more protected area and they can grow bigger. They'll be, stronger before you put them out, but the direct seeding, it just is super fast and easy, so it's a balance.
Mm-hmm. Along those same lines, somebody was curious about what you're doing in terms about to deal with slugs and deer. Is there anything you do differently as a dry farmer, or do you just have any useful hints with regard to slugs and deer?
Oh yeah, they're arch nemesis. We've been battling the deer for a long time, well, since we've been here, but this year we got a dog. It seemed like the only thing, the last thing on our list to do. because we couldn't really afford like a 12-foot fence around our whole property, and they would come from all different places. But it is helping. I do cage most of my things just in case, because they do break in, sometimes, and they'll eat things. But gosh, the deer are hard. If you have a property that the deer are used to coming in, it is very, very difficult to stop them. But the dog seems to work right now. I'm still crossing my fingers. About the slugs, slugs are gross and I hate them, but fortunately for dry farming, as soon as it dries out, they're gone. So you don't have to worry about them eating your tomatoes or, eating your plants as long as they're big enough to sort of survive the first onslaught in May. You're good. I have tried using Sluggo, which is the only thing I'd use out there. However, I've found that birds will eat the Sluggo very quick. As soon as I put it out there, I've seen birds come gobble it up. And then I've also seen ants eat them and take them away for some reason. So it didn't really work for me. And I sort of just have to wait till it dries out and the slugs go away, because there's so many of them. And for example, this year the slugs ate all my cucumber babies, and I just had to replant. So I don't know. I don't have a good solution for those. And
Okay.
yeah.
And then we've got another question about the soils and whether you amend or mulch right after harvest. So doing things in the fall to see if that would help retain moisture that starts falling before even or during the winter.
No, after harvest, I'm done. I sort of I'm tired of working out there, and I just leave it. I even leave a lot of the plant matter out there, and I'll just let that break down naturally, or I'll cut it and let it lay on top of the surface. As far as trying to collect the moisture, it's actually better if you don't have any covering when it's raining for it to absorb. So the mulch, any mulch layer will act as a barrier both ways. So if the rain starts falling, it will absorb quicker if there's no mulch. And the point in the spring is to have that water already in the soil and then create the barrier for it to barrier to evaporating and coming out. So I don't do anything. I just leave it. It'll get saturated again naturally. And I try to tarp it as soon as the weeds start coming up, and that's usually in the winter time when it really gets rainy and stuff. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Now through the season, if you notice you've got plants that are looking unhappy, do you amend? Are there things you do to try to perk things up?
I usually will, if like soon after, during planting, we do water a little bit, like during transplanting, and sometimes if there's like a really big heat spell, like last year it was like 95 or whatever in the first week of May, and if we happen to hit that, we can hand water. Luckily we're a really small farm, and since we use wider spacing, there's not really that many plants, so it is possible to hand water a little bit. But after June, we don't really water at all, and sort of things just go, if things are struggling, it's not really worth it to try to baby them. So I just leave it.
Okay, and I see we're just a little over time, so maybe this should be the last question, but I think it's a good one for the last question. Do you accept woofers?
Yes, that's a good question. We do, and I used to be a woofer before, so I really love that program. Think it's awesome, and we do also just accept volunteers too if you want to come for the day and see what we're doing. We have a lot of different projects, not just dry farming. We do natural building and other fun things too. So yeah. just contact me.
All right. Well, I think then that was marvelous. Thank you. Just such an
Oh,
interesting approach. And, you know, I've heard about dry farming. I didn't know anything about it. So it was just really interesting. I've got raised beds,
Mm-hmm.
but that was really fascinating.
Awesome.
Yeah. Thank
Erica?
you, Eliza. That was great. And yeah, just for those of you who are interested in this topic, the Dry Farming Collaborative, it's worth checking out what they're doing and all the different trials. I've gone to one or two of their meetings, and it's a pretty neat little organic group that's going on where everyone's just kind of really building it together. So I encourage everyone to check out some of these links that Eliza shared with us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Oh, all righty then. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk with us, and appreciate also the information about the store. Look forward to wandering out that way. So
Great. Good luck with your gardens.
Yeah, thank
Oh.
you.
Thank you very much.